they do it for practical reasons because it's the one thing they all agree on that you can measure and test and go from. We'll all use that as the base.
Well, we all know that the main event is actually ovulation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So the pattern is, oh wow, I was about to go into the pattern. I was like, this actually starts before that. I'll come back to that. Remind me of the year.
Okay.
So the pattern is interesting. So after menses, which is essentially the lining of the womb plus blood, but we think of it as blood, but it's the lining of the womb plus blood, plus immune cells, plus hormones, plus lots of stuff is in the flow. That happens, and automatically, and it happens because the level of hormones dips to, not to nothing, but like it dips precipitously. And it's the loss of hormones that stops the body or the brain, if you like, from like driving the cycle. It's like, oh, this is the end. It's like the outbreath. And then menses happens. And so it's like then you're taking a breath to start again almost. Yeah, so the follicular phase, based on the idea that the body's now producing follicles. The rise of estrogen is what drives that. And the follicles grow in size. People think of it as a race. I kind of push back against that idea, but if you just go with it for a minute, I'll push back in a second. There's a race between like a handful of eggs, and each egg is in its own follicle. So it's a race between the follicles to kind of become the one that ovulates. Estrogen drives that. And then and of course, it's the FSH, the famous FSH, that drives the estrogen. So it's like the FSH tells the follicles to grow, and as the follicles grow, they release estrogen, and the estrogen, has become the main hormone that you'd measure. They grow hugely in comparison to their original size.
And this is all it starts from the brain.
Yeah.
The brain signals down to the gonads, as they're known as, or to the ovaries.
To the
anyway,
ovaries,
in the woman, or in men, their gonads would be known as the testes.
Yeah.
But for the women, that's in the ovary.
That's right. So the FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, it stimulates the follicles. They use the same name in men, but it's stimulating the testicles. Yeah. So it's like a priming, telling them to grow, and as they grow, they produce more estrogen, and that reaches a sort of a crescendo in a normal cycle. That would reach a crescendo, and that sets in motion this signal to sort of trigger the ovulation, and
so that's your positive feedback.
That's your positive feedback. So the thing that triggers the ovulation is the other famous hormone, the LH, the luteinizing hormone. So the brain notices the rise in estrogen, and it suddenly pumps out a hit of LH, and that sort of causes the final ovulation of the biggest egg, the one that won the race.
And LH is what many women may recognize as something that they would measure if they are trying for a baby. They're trying to get pregnant. Yeah,
they measure FSH and LH, and you can make different pronunciations on what their levels and the ratios over time. But essentially, they're if you think of them as the brain talking to the ovaries, that's kind of what it is.
Yeah.
And yeah, so roughly this thing about the 28-day cycle, that definitely exists, but it's not actually, like, most women wouldn't have a 28-day cycle. They'd have maybe 1 or 2 days different, and then in some cases, if you graph it, it's kind of like the long tail on the graph. Like, a lot of women have completely different shapes and sizes to their cycles. Some of that is probably normal, but some of that is because of what you might call a brain kind of dysregulation, or like a misfiring.
Mm-hmm.
It might be normal for them, but it's not like kind of normal, so to speak. And that would be the thing you try to fix if you were trying to fix the problem. We could come back to that in a while, but so essentially, yeah, the egg pops out and gets swept up into the fallopian tubes, hangs around the fallopian tubes waiting for a handsome night to show up, a sperm. 99% of the time they don't, because it's not, you're not trying to get pregnant. But the interesting part of that is, like, the next part of the cycle kicks off at the moment of ovulation, and the follicle that's left over when the egg pops out of it, it's literally clinging to the outside of the ovary. The follicle is that starts to produce the progesterone.
So this is your corpus luteum.
That's your corpus luteum.
The yellow body.
The yellow body, yeah. You can see pictures of it. They grow, like, they can grow, and that grows relative to the ovary. They can grow, like, quite big. They're smaller than the ovary, but they're visible with the eye. They're quite big, like, in comparison to what the egg was.
And this is over the course of a few hours. This can actually dramatically grow. It's a whole new gland in itself.
It's a whole new gland, yeah. And so it's pumping out progesterone, and the progesterone in the second half, the luteal phase of the cycle, is sort of maturing the womb lining. It's doing 100 other things, but it's maturing the womb lining. And so I think the best description that I've heard of that years ago from an American lecturer, actually, lady, was, it's like estrogen tells the womb lining to grow, and then progesterone tells the womb lining to grow up.
Yeah.
And to mature. And so it's like somewhere in that kind of dance of hormones, you will most often find some sort of a problem in women who have infertility. It may not be the core problem, but it's often a reflection of the problem. And that's what you're trying to fix. And of course, by the end of the luteal phase, let's say it's 2 weeks in a sort of a picture-perfect cycle, the feedback system of the brain causes it's like as if it says, okay, time for a breather, and the hormones stop getting produced. The corpus luteum, in fact, runs out of vitality. That's what causes the timing. The corpus luteum itself is programmed to kind of pump out progesterone for like around 2 weeks, and it can't really do it for much longer than that.
So the luteal phase in itself doesn't go beyond 14, maximum 16 days?
Yeah, very small. Yeah, very small variation. Yeah.
So while women may have a long cycle that may say that they're 42 days cycle, they'll still know that luteal phase, if that does happen, if ovulation does happen, it will only ever be between maybe the maximum 14, 16 days. And the rest would have been the follicular phase that actually extends in length.
Yeah.
For women.
That's right. So exactly. So it's always like the variation cycle always comes from the first part of the cycle. And if the second phase, the luteal phase, which can vary by a couple of days only, if it's like too short, if it's like less than 10 days long, that's typically not enough time for the progesterone to mature the womb lining. And so if menses happens before the womb is fully matured, you have what they call a luteal phase defect. And you shed the womb, you can't really get pregnant because it's not mature enough to sort of manage the implantation. So one of the ways to see what the problem is, I don't want to say this is like the way, because there's lots of different reasons for infertility, but one of the reasons is like a luteal phase defect, or like a not enough time for the womb lining to mature. One of the ways you can tell that is by looking at the hormone pattern. And that's probably a topic in itself. We can come back to that. But it's a very interesting way of looking into what's actually happening. Because if you look at it properly, you can see what's happening in the body, but what the brain also trying to do with the body. So what's the body doing and what's the brain telling it to do? And you can see, if you see a mismatch between them, you can kind of go, oh, okay, that's maybe where the problem is there, or you can kind of trace back the root cause of that. But essentially, that's it. That's a kind of a long-winded way of giving a short story of, these natural cycles. But actually, the important part of that story, we focus on egg quality. Obviously, you need good egg quality to produce a healthy baby. But the energy investment of the body, of the ovaries, in the egg, in the follicle and in the egg, is kind of the key determining factor there. So even though I talked about the brain releasing hormones to tell the ovaries what to do, ultimately, if you find a problem within that story, it almost always traces back to some sort of problem with the fundamental physics, if you like, of the energy production system. And what I call like erratic or unstable energy production is almost like the bottom line problem. And from that, everything ripples out. And the problems that you see can kind of be traced back to that. And there's no easy fix for that, but that's what therapy is about. It's finding a kind of a difficult fix for a difficult problem, but that's the core of it.
So this is where you might end up exploring things like thyroid function for somebody, for example, that, to see how well their metabolism is functioning. And if there's an issue with thyroid, that can certainly have a massive effect on the ovaries. But that would be something that you can explore through testing, etc.
That's exactly it, yeah. I mean, women who go through fertility treatment, almost all of them at some point will become familiar with the fact that the doctor will measure thyroid hormone, and they'll try and manage the thyroid hormone with thyroid drugs if they have to. But I often get asked, well, why is it thyroid? What's that got to do with it? And like if you connect, and basically the answer is you connect the thyroid. Basically the problem is what I said a while ago. It's the energy is the problem, but the thyroid system is, here's a simple way to think of what thyroid hormone is in the body. It doesn't give the body energy. It doesn't give the body nutrients to make energy. It doesn't do any of that. All it is a permission slip to make energy. So it's like thyroid goes into all the cells of the body, including the ovary cells. And it gives them permission. It says, yeah, go ahead there and make energy. Yeah, go ahead there and make some more energy. And the next thyroid molecule comes in and says, yeah, go ahead there and make more. And if like loads of thyroid goes in, it's like, make energy. And if only a small few thyroid molecules go in, it's like, make some energy. And so it's so the strength of the thyroid signal is directly proportional to the permission that the cell gets to produce the energy. And so that's why it's so intrinsically tied to infertility.
So it's fundamentally telling the body it's either feast or famine. So
yes.
In other words, there's enough around here in abundance that you can actually hold and create a healthy baby and go on to hold the pregnancy or whatever else. Or it's saying, not right now. There just isn't adequate necessarily nutrients or energy here to sustain.
I see what you just said there as the thing that would explain most pre-modern thyroid problems. or energy problems, in the sense that like there's been thyroid problems since day one in the human race. There's always been someone with a thyroid problem, but there's way more of them now. It's just way bigger than it ever was. And in our, let's call it our ancestral past, what you said is exactly true. So it's like the signal in the brain that says, how much thyroid hormone will be produced this second? And then the next second, like, how much thyroid hormone will be produced this second? And that second by second calculation, that's made by referencing the body's fuel supply and other hormones and like blood glucose and lots of different like nutritional kind of inputs, if you like. And so if there wasn't enough food around at the time, the body would kind of go, we don't have a whole lot of those nutrients on board. Better kind of tell the thyroid system to back off a little bit so as it stops telling the cells to go and produce energy because they don't have the raw materials. We've only got like 50% or 80% of what we want. So like back off a little bit. So I think that explains most historical thyroid problems. Today, it's way more complicated. That is still true. And definitely from a modern diet point of view, the nutrient levels are way less. This is going back to my Weston Price story. The modern story with thyroid is so much more complicated now than it used to be. I'm going to say there's like 3 reasons. One of them is, yes, we don't have, yes, the modern food supply is lacking in the abundant amount of micronutrients that we need. And that's what I was saying about, that kind of connects back to my earlier Weston Price story. That's definitely something, you could explore. So the lack of it's not that you're like deficient in a clinical setting, because if you were deficient, you'd have a deficiency syndrome, but it's insufficient. That's the kind of word that's the modern word we've come to use. It's insufficient. It's just not enough for optimal function. And so that's one reason we have all kinds of problems, but focusing on the thyroid, that's one reason we have thyroid problems. For example, like iodine deficiency is fairly common around the world, and you need iodine to make thyroid hormone. It's as simple as that. But you need zinc, you need iron, you need lots of other things. Iron is the most common deficiency in the world, and that's even true in the Western world, which is kind of hard to believe, but it's true. And iron is so intrinsically involved in thyroid hormone production. So if you're low in iron, that'll affect your thyroid. It'll affect 100 other things, but it'll affect your thyroid. But I think one of the big things that we're grappling with, particularly in the Western world, is the massive rise of autoimmune-driven thyroid function, which means your immune system is targeting some aspect of your thyroid gland. There's a number of different aspects, a number of different targets on the thyroid gland.
So you're talking about Hashimoto's in particular?
Talking about Hashimoto's in particular, the most common one. And I think Hashimoto's is on the rise around the world, but in the Western world in particular. But there's more people that are on the way to getting it than actually have it. And that's kind of common with a lot of diseases. Like the sort of the gradual build-up is...
It's a long latency period.
It's a long latency period, yeah. And so I think, but the same process is underway the whole time. That's the problem.
So the way that we might talk about somebody being pre-diabetic, there's pre-thyroid.
Exactly. It's exactly the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. And this actually ties straight back into the idea of what's the difference between the medical approach and, let's say, the natural health approach to fertility. When it comes to thyroid is a classic example of that. When it comes to treating the thyroid, the medical system will measure your thyroid hormone. It will measure I mentioned autoimmunity there a minute ago. Like you detect autoimmunity by measuring antibodies against the thyroid. It will measure them, but it doesn't do anything about them. It'll basically say, yeah, you've got a thyroid problem. You're either producing less thyroid than you should, or you're going to soon produce less thyroid than you should because of the damage being done.
So we're going to wait
and see, or we give you the thyroid hormone. That's the mono approach. We'll give you thyroid hormone. So like if you back up there for a minute, it's kind of easy. It's not even like hidden or complicated to say, if you're low in iron, and that's kind of common, that'll affect your thyroid. So if you're low in iron and you've got a thyroid problem, you should really just like find out that the iron is the problem and correct the iron first. But that doesn't happen. Now, I'm not saying doctors don't measure iron. I'm just using that as one example. They'll measure iron for iron's sake, but they won't necessarily measure iron for your thyroid's sake. And
this is not us trying to diss the medical community in any way, shape or form. This is us just trying to say that, look, there has to be at least an acknowledgement that there are other factors involved before you start to jump to medication.
Yeah.
And even to supplementation, because neither of us would jump to supplementation ahead of checking actually to see what are the actual requirements for this individual.
Yeah, the diet itself.
The diet itself is the basic testing ground.
I don't see it as like sort of dissing the medical community. I kind of see it as understanding the kind of two different lanes that they're in. If there's a problem in, I think, the public's mindset, it's that the entire lane is covered by the medical community. That's the problem, when it's not. The medical treatment lane is covered by the medical community, but the sort of the building the foundation isn't, understanding the nutrients isn't. That's not part of medical treatment. And it shouldn't be. It's too big a thing. That's why you need nutritionists, or you know what I mean. So I'm not dissing them at all. I would say, like, if I was a doctor and I was nutritionally aware, I'd be looking for diseases to treat, but I'd be kind of referring the clients that have these functional problems to people in another lane who take care of those things. So I don't see it as dissing it. I see it as like this. It's like the system needs to sort of. There's a word for it. It's not integrative medicine. It's like, you'll come back to me, but like the
Collaborative.
it's collaborative, but there's a sort of translational medicine or something they call it. It's like translating, like, from the ground of what people really need into the medical system. There is actually a big effort underway by the sort of people that, let's say, manage the medical system to fix this problem, but it's very far from being put into place on the ground. That's my problem. So it's not a diss at all. It's just like it's an expression of honest reality of what's happening. But just to finish my point on the thyroid, it's like, yes, there's a nutrient issue, but there's also an immune issue. And I said there was three. I think there's three sort of main things going on. The third one is very hard to sort of do anything about, but I think it's on the rise. It's basically that the other two problems are giving rise to offspring that have, from almost day one, a compromised thyroid system. So they maybe went through their gestation period in the womb with insufficient nutrients. And so their thyroid never matured fully. And so they're always somewhat compromised.
If we hold it there for a second, then we're also talking about the fetus. If there is a pregnancy, the fetus is dependent on the mother's thyroid.
The fetus is dependent on the mother's thyroid initially, and then the thyroid develops and it takes over and it starts using its own iodine, tyrosine, proteins, vitamins, minerals to handle its own thyroid. And if those minerals they don't even have to be deficient. Remember, deficient versus insufficient, two different words, but one is like a clinical diagnosis and the other is just a tendency to have not enough.
It's a spectrum. I suppose
kind of a spectrum, exactly, yeah. And like, okay, let's be honest, we don't know what the top optimal is. So that's trial and error for all the different people. You have to, that's part of the therapy. You got to figure it out. But it's a spectrum, and you're trying to move towards more and more optimal nutrient intake in order to solve a lot of these foundational problems. So for a baby in the womb, if the mother doesn't have enough iodine, that's a common one because iodine is directly used to make thyroid hormone. But there's like 10 nutrients that are sort of ancillary players to the production of thyroid hormone, like zinc and iron, as I mentioned before, and vitamin A. And if they're insufficient, it's not just that in that moment, the baby's in the womb, that their thyroid won't be able to produce enough thyroid hormone. It's not just that. It's that it's like the priming of the thyroid gland itself will become kind of set within those parameters. And when the baby's born, we never got to full expression of ourselves.
It's like setting a thermostat.
It's like setting a thermostat. And like, as soon as the cord is cut, the thyroid is what it is. And if it could have been bigger and better, it will never get there. So that's the third problem. And
so we're looking at the potential.
You're looking at potential. I think in those cases, you end up with a tendency, but not a guarantee, but a tendency towards thyroid problems. It might become like your weak link, say. And maybe you need to take, if you're that baby and you grow up, maybe you need to take extra nutrients to mind your thyroid gland. And if you don't, you're more susceptible to a thyroid problem, that kind of thing. So I think that's the mix of what's happening in the world. But like bringing it back to the fertility issue. Well, that baby, first of all, that's more so if it's a woman and wants to have a baby than a man, just producing the sperm. It'll affect both, but more so the woman who has to go through the monthly rise and fall in the demand for energy and the need for thyroid every cycle, and then try and get it right for that 1 or 2 or 5 cycles where you actually have a baby. That just gets harder for that person because they were kind of slightly born compromised. And, and there's no way to really tell. We know this from like epidemiological studies, but there's no way to tell. You can't look at a person when they're born and measure the thyroid. And if look at it and go, oh, isn't enough, unless it's severe, you can't really say, there's a problem with the thyroid gland. You can't really say it. You just don't know until later on when the problem shows up. It's an invisible issue, but I think it's a growing problem.
As you say, it's about the suboptimal. At that point, it's not that you've fallen off the end of the ranges in any.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So normally we look at, blood tests, and a doctor may say, oh, no, you're fine, until somebody just reaches the edge and the borderline and it just flips into the red.
Yeah,
red
yeah.
zone.
And you feel the same, but Now
Yeah.
you're getting treated.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. We want to catch you long before you fall off the edge.
I think that story of optimal versus adequate, let's say, is the story of our time. Like it runs through the food system in particular. And this is the thing like that. Well, it's funny to put it this way, but if that, I'll explain the problem in a second, but if the problem was fixed, hypothetically, the great news is we'd be out of a job. You know, a lot of us would be out of a job. And to which I would honestly say, brilliant. Now I can go back and look after my hens, my dogs, and do other stuff instead of having to work hard doing this stuff, you know, because people don't have the problem. That's a long way off. But the problem is a kind of a standardization around the world of, I'm going to say governments, just to capture the idea. Governments, particularly the American government, figured out, what do we need to be healthy? What do we need to live? What do we need to survive? And from that, they came up with like the recommended daily allowances of X, Y, and Z nutrient. I mean, it's a very important thing, but it's standardized. And from that came the other big thing that you and me know very well, people talk about, but the food pyramid. And so the food pyramid was like this idea of like, how do we organize for the government? You're like, how do we organize society so that they don't run into serious malnutrition problems? If you step back from it and think about it, that's a gigantic task, because lots of countries, and here we are in Ireland, but lots of countries have had famines. Lots of countries have had populations decimated by sudden losses of food. It's not like a simple idea. It's not a trivial idea. It's a kind of a, how do we build into the system food security so that some hit doesn't like cause half the population to die in the next 2 years? And it is that stark. Like, it's a reality of a thing that could happen. And we think in the modern world that wouldn't happen. But like, we were pushing the limits during COVID. Like, could the ships not bring the stuff in? What if the machines break down, not just the food, but you couldn't retool a country fast enough to capture a catastrophic collapse of the food supply so that you grow the food fast? You couldn't do it. There'd be mass starvation. So anyway,
It was very telling as well during COVID when it was the first items were the bread.
Yeah.
The bread shelves just cleared
That's
out
right.
completely.
Yeah.
That on the toilet paper, the running joke about the toilet paper.
It's the running joke, but it's not even a joke. Yeah, it's a real thing.
All the white produce was gone, and so many of the vegetables were left.
That was a warning shot over the bow. But the point I'm making is, like, I'm not dissing the food pyramid, because it's a necessary thing. But here's the point:
at a population level,
it's a necessary thing. Yeah.
But on a very micro, individual level, we need something far more
exactly
nest in a sense.
Yes. So the way I look at it is, it's like the government's job is to keep you safe and keep you alive, let's say, right? Not their job to make sure you're healthy and fit and you can run a mile in 4 minutes and, you know, that you're eating up. It's not their job, and it shouldn't be their job. And heaven forbid that it ever became their job. And that's our job, and that's your job and my job. And that's the difference between adequate and optimal. It's like, look, we've made sure society's organized in a way that keeps you alive. If you want to go beyond that, you go beyond that. And that's kind of what we do. That's what nutritionists do. They try and get people to go beyond that. And
so it's going from feeling fine to fabulous.
Exactly. Yeah, that's it, kind of it. Yeah.
Or from ordinary to extraordinary.
And I would say, yeah, that's it. That's it. That's a positive way of looking at it. But there's a but. To get there, it's like you have to go through a bit of pain.
It takes work.
It takes work.
Determination.
And determination and mindset and dedication. And I'm going to say, nearly every case, if you make fundamental changes to your diet, you are going to run into your own limitations at some point. And that's where the hard work is, and that's where the exciting work is, in fact. So, like, if you were in prison and somebody forced your diet change on you, then it would just be, you just eat the food you're given. So it's not a problem.